The Harvest Festival Volunteer. In October of 2019, my life was routine in the way public service jobs often are. I was 34, employed as a county social worker out of Elkhart County, Indiana. My assignment at the time was community outreach, short-term placements in rural areas where families didn't often seek services on their own. I worked regular hours, filled out intake forms, coordinated with nonprofits, and spent a lot of time driving two-lane roads between small towns most people passed through without stopping. Cassopolis sat just across the Michigan line. Population under 2,000. One main street, a handful of churches, and farmland stretching in every direction. The Harvest Festival there was considered a community cornerstone. The Cassopolis Community Trust had been running it for decades. Corn maze, hay rides, food stalls, children's games. From an outreach perspective, it was perfect. Families gathered. Barriers were low. People talked. I volunteered because it was part of my job, but also because nothing about it raised concerns. It was October. Seasonal events were normal. There were no prior complaints, no police reports, no rumors documented in county files. At least none that were easy to find. The trigger wasn't dramatic. It was an assignment email forwarded by my supervisor asking for a county presence at the festival for the final weekend, including Halloween night. I accepted without hesitation. The trust handled logistics. Volunteers wore identical badges and green jackets with stitched pumpkins on the sleeve. I was assigned to children's activity coordination and general oversight support. The first 2 days passed without incident. Attendance was steady. Kids laughed. Parents drank cider. The corn maze was the biggest attraction. 12 acres carved into a looping pattern on the old Hendricks farm, land leased annually to the trust. Nothing felt wrong. Not yet. Cassopolis itself felt cut off in subtle ways. Cell service was unreliable outside the center of town. The festival grounds were a 10-minute drive from the nearest gas station. After sunset, the surrounding fields went completely dark. No highway noise, no distant lights. The maze sat at the far edge of the property. Once you stepped inside, the sound of the festival dropped away quickly. Corn walls higher than my head. Packed dirt underfoot. The kind of place where orientation disappears after a few turns. Locals navigated it easily. Outsiders lingered near the entrance. I didn't understand why until later. On the second evening, just before dusk, I noticed a shift. Volunteers who had been friendly all day became quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People checked watches. Several glanced repeatedly toward the corn maze as the sun lowered. By 7 o'clock, most local volunteers had left. They cited early mornings, cold weather, family obligations. Out-of-town staff, college kids, myself, a few seasonal hires, remained to close stations. I asked one of the older women why locals cleared out so early. She smiled tightly and said it was just tradition. Another told me not to stay late near the maze. When I pressed for clarification, she changed the subject. None of it rose to the level of a reportable concern, but it registered. Over the next day, I started noticing patterns. The same surnames appeared repeatedly on volunteer rosters. The same 7 people rotated supervisory roles year after year. The trust board members overlapped heavily with maze oversight. When I asked for a printed maze map for safety orientation, I was told the latest version wasn't available. An older one was handed to me instead, creased, dated, and missing a section near the center. I made a note of it in my personal log. Not an official report, just something to remember. Halloween night was colder than expected. The festival stayed open late for teenagers. At 8:30 p.m. I was stationed at the maze entrance. 5 teens entered together. I logged the time, standard procedure. At 8:50, 4 exited. They didn't joke or talk. One girl cried silently. When I asked where their friend was, they hesitated. Finally, one whispered that Connor was still inside. "With them," he said. Before I could question further, I radioed for assistance. No response. I grabbed a flashlight and entered, violating protocol because a minor was unaccounted for. Less than 5 minutes in, I found a volunteer badge on the ground. It was cracked and smeared with dried blood. That was the first undeniable piece of evidence that something had gone wrong. I tried radioing again, still nothing. My phone showed no signal. I documented the badge location mentally and continued. Later, when I reported this, trust representatives claimed no badges were missing. That statement would later be proven false. As I moved deeper, the maze was wrong. Scare stations were abandoned. Props were intact, but no staff. Then the sounds changed. The wind dropped. Insects stopped. I heard voices, low, rhythmic, coordinated. I followed them toward a clearing that wasn't on the map. In the clearing, 7 volunteers stood in a circle, same uniforms, faces painted white, streaked with black. It looked deliberate, not theatrical. In the center was Connor, bound to a wooden platform. I saw additional evidence immediately: candles burned down to stubs, bone fragments arranged in geometric patterns, and carved symbols in the dirt. Later, analysis would confirm the bones were animal, but not recently placed. I confronted them. One spoke calmly about the harvest and volunteers. When I threatened to call police, they broke formation and fled into the maze. Connor was alive. That mattered. Getting him out wasn't clean. Someone followed us through the corn. I heard movement close behind. At one point, Connor stumbled, and I thought we wouldn't make it. We didn't see who it was. We didn't need to. We exited at 9:07 p.m. The parking lot was empty. I drove straight to the sheriff's office across county lines. Deputies contacted Michigan authorities. A joint search began before midnight. They found the clearing. They found buried items beneath the platform. A metal box containing journals, names, dates, 23 years of entries, each Halloween. 7 arrests followed. All were senior members of the Cassopolis Community Trust. Interrogations revealed coordinated silence and rehearsed statements. They claimed symbolism, tradition, community protection. Soil samples told a different story. Human blood traces from at least 4 unidentified individuals. No missing persons reports matched. Trials concluded in 2021. Convictions were secured. The trust dissolved quietly. Assets were redistributed. The festival ended permanently. The Hendricks farm still exists. The maze no longer operates, but the land is used seasonally. Connor doesn't talk about what happened before I arrived. Therapists say memory suppression is likely. Every October, I review my notes. I think about how long it went unnoticed, how many people chose not to ask questions, how easy it was for something like that to hide behind tradition, and I wonder how many other towns still do. The Door-to-Door Census Taker. My name is Rebecca Chow. In October of 2017, I was 28 years old and working as a field representative for the U.S. Census Bureau. I had been with the Bureau for a little over 3 years. Before Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, I'd worked assignments in suburban Maryland, parts of New Jersey, and one short stint outside Pittsburgh. The job was repetitive by design. Knock, introduce myself, show federal credentials, ask questions, leave. Most days started the same way. I woke up before sunrise, reviewed my route list over instant coffee, checked my tablet for updates, and drove county roads for hours at a time. The work was quiet, procedural, and deliberately non-confrontational. We were trained to avoid conflict, document refusals, and escalate only when absolutely necessary. I had never felt unsafe doing it. Cumberland County changed that assumption within my first week. The assignment was part of the American Community Survey, not the decennial census people recognize. Ongoing data collection, smaller sample size, deeper questions. I was given a cluster of rural addresses near the western edge of the county, close to Pinchot State Forest. Most were isolated farmhouses or properties separated by long gravel driveways and tree lines that blocked visibility from the road. The first few days were tense but manageable. People were suspicious in a way that felt organized rather than individual. Several residents refused to open the door at all. Others answered and became hostile the moment I identified myself as a federal employee. One man demanded I leave immediately and followed me back to my car. Another retrieved a shotgun from behind his door and only lowered it after inspecting my ID for nearly a minute. Each incident was logged and reported. My supervisor acknowledged the reports but didn't adjust the assignment. She reminded me that rural communities often distrusted government representatives and that refusal rates were already high in the area. Completing the route, she said, was a priority. By the second week, I noticed a pattern. Certain addresses had been reassigned repeatedly over the years. Some had annotations going back decades. No contact. Refused. Structure uninhabitable. Yet the addresses remained active in the system. When I asked why properties marked abandoned were still on my list, I was told the data lagged behind real conditions. It wasn't unusual. October 31st fell on a Tuesday that year. I was behind schedule due to weather delays and refusals. By late afternoon, I had 3 addresses left, all clustered along a narrow road that ended at the forest boundary. 2 of the houses were clearly abandoned, roofs sagging, windows boarded, no utility connections. I documented them and moved on. The final address sat at the end of a gravel driveway nearly a quarter-mile long. No mailbox, no exterior lights. Dense woods on all sides. A rusted pickup truck was parked near a barn, its tires half sunk into the mud. Someone was there. I knocked. No response. I knocked again. As I stepped back, preparing to log a non-contact, I heard a voice behind me. "You're early." The man had approached without sound. He stood several feet away, hands at his sides. He appeared to be in his 50s. Overalls, faded flannel. His face was thin. His expression unreadable. I asked him to clarify what he meant. He said, "The collection," as if it were a scheduled appointment. I identified myself, showed my credentials, and explained the survey. He listened without interrupting, then said I should come inside. The sun was already low. I was trained to avoid entering homes unless necessary, but the guidelines allowed it with consent. I followed him. The interior was dim. Kerosene lamps provided uneven light. The smell was stale, with an underlying sweetness I couldn't identify at the time. The kitchen table was covered in paper, stacks of old census forms dating back decades. They were meticulously filled out, but the names were not conventional. Many were numeric. Others were labeled offering or volunteer. When I asked about them, he called them family records. The survey responses were inconsistent. He claimed 8 residents, but could not produce any of them. Ages were listed in a way that made no demographic sense. Employment statuses didn't align with the property's condition. I terminated the interview and stood to leave. That's when I heard movement below us, a low, rhythmic sound from the basement. Repetitive, heavy. He smiled. It was the first change in his expression since I'd arrived. He said they were ready. When I reached for the door, he grabbed my arm. His grip was cold and unexpectedly strong. He told me I was on the list. I pulled free and ran. I don't remember the drive clearly. I remember headlights cutting through trees, gravel hitting the underside of my car, and shapes emerging from the farmhouse. More than one, moving faster than they should have been able to. I went directly to the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Carlisle and filed a report. An officer accompanied me while I gave a recorded statement. My supervisor was notified but did not arrive. The next morning, state police executed a warrant on the property. What they found confirmed that my experience was not isolated. Human remains were discovered in the basement, in shallow graves, and scattered across the property. Some were skeletal, others partially preserved. Forensic analysis eventually identified at least 19 individuals, with estimated dates of death spanning from the early 1950s to the late 2000s. Property records showed continuous ownership by the Dietrich family for over a century. Missing persons reports in the surrounding counties showed a recurring pattern. Disappearances every 10 years, often involving transients, temporary workers, or door-to-door representatives. Horace Dietrich and 4 relatives were arrested. During questioning, they described their actions as assistants. They believed census counts were incomplete and that certain people would not be missed. They referred to their activity as a form of civic responsibility. As the investigation expanded, questions arose about oversight failures. Previous complaints about the property had been filed and closed without follow-up. Local officials cited lack of evidence. Records showed inspections that never occurred. Federal agencies became involved. Evidence was seized. Protocols were reviewed. The Census Bureau revised its field procedures quietly, without public acknowledgement of the incident's scope. The case received brief national attention before coverage stopped. Court proceedings were delayed. Some details remained sealed. I resigned from the Bureau 3 months later. I still think about the addresses that stay on lists long after they should have been removed. And when I see a long driveway disappearing into trees, I think about how many times someone knocked, documented a refusal, and drove away, never knowing what was being counted and what was being taken. The Halloween Party Caterer. In October of 2018, I was 26 years old and working as a catering supervisor for Platinum Events in Charleston, South Carolina. My job was logistical, not creative. I managed staff schedules, verified deliveries, handled client walkthroughs, and made sure nothing caught fire, figuratively or literally. Weddings blurred together. Corporate mixers paid the bills. Halloween season was always the busiest, especially for wealthy clients who wanted exclusivity and spectacle without public attention. That year, my days followed a predictable rhythm. I woke before dawn, checked event briefs over coffee, coordinated with vendors, and spent evenings labeling trays or inventorying glassware. I didn't socialize much. I trusted procedures more than people. That mindset kept things orderly. On October 26th, our office received a high-priority booking flagged by management, a private Halloween event at Ravenswood Estate, 30 miles northwest of Charleston near Monk's Corner. The client was Marcus Kincaid. The budget was $15,000, cash deposit, no negotiation, 60 guests, full service. The property had been in the Kincaid family for generations. That detail came from Marcus himself during our initial call. He spoke calmly, confidently and with an emphasis on tradition. He requested a Gothic Victorian theme and specified that his household staff would remain present throughout the event. No outside security, no photographers, no press. Those requests weren't unheard of. Wealthy clients often wanted discretion. I logged the details, assigned a 4-person team including myself, and scheduled 2 days of prep. We arrived at Ravenswood Estate on the afternoon of October 31st. The drive itself was isolating. Once we left the main highway, the road narrowed and lost cell signal in stretches. The GPS lagged, trees closed in. Spanish moss hung low enough to brush the roof of the van. The estate sat at the end of a long, curved drive bordered by iron fencing and old stone markers half swallowed by weeds. The house was an antebellum mansion. White exterior, wide columns, symmetrical windows that reflected the sky without revealing the interior. It was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like sound had been absorbed over time. Marcus met us at the front steps. Mid-40s, well-dressed, polite. He shook my hand and addressed me by name without checking his notes. He walked us through the ballroom where the event would take place. Dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, tall windows overlooking the grounds. As we unloaded equipment, I noticed the estate staff. They weren't in modern uniforms. The women wore long dresses with aprons. The men wore suspenders and high-collared shirts. Everything looked period-accurate, down to the shoes. I assumed it was part of the theme. When I commented on the coordination, Marcus paused. "Those aren't costumes," he said. "That's just how we maintain tradition here." He said it plainly, without irony. Then he moved on to table placement. That was the first irregularity. As evening approached, more details stood out. The staff avoided eye contact. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They referred to Marcus as Sir or Mr. Kincaid, never by first name. Certain doors in the house were locked, including one at the far end of the ballroom corridor. I asked about it and was told it led to family archives and was off limits. Guests began arriving around 7 p.m. Their costumes were elaborate and historically consistent. Victorian gowns, tailored suits, masks that obscured entire faces. No modern outfits, no casual interpretations. Everyone fit the same aesthetic. I noted this because it suggested coordination beyond a casual party. By 8:30 p.m., the event appeared normal. Food service proceeded without issue. Guests drank, talked, laughed. Music played softly. My team rotated stations. I kept track of time and inventory. At approximately 9 p.m., Marcus raised a glass and called for attention. He stood in the center of the ballroom and thanked the guests for honoring another year of prosperity. His language shifted slightly, more formal, more ceremonial. He referred to the night as sacred and spoke of legacy. Then he said, "And as always, the offering must be made." The room went quiet. Guests moved without instruction, forming a circle along the walls. The center of the room was cleared. My staff froze. This wasn't scripted entertainment. There was no performer scheduled. 2 estate staff members exited through the locked corridor door and returned moments later with a young man bound at the wrists and gagged. He was shaking. His clothes were dirty, inconsistent with the rest of the event. I stepped forward and demanded an explanation. Marcus smiled and told me to continue my duties. I reached for my phone. A woman in a crimson gown grabbed my wrist before I could dial. Her grip was firm and practiced. She told me quietly to put it away. That's when I noticed the weapons. Not everyone had one, but enough did. Handguns tucked into waistbands. Antique blades displayed openly. The guests weren't panicking, they were focused. The chanting started shortly after, low, rhythmic, in a language I didn't recognize, Latin or something similar. The sound filled the room and seemed to press inward. This was the silent dread moment, the realization that no one else was coming, that the doors were controlled, that sound had effectively stopped existing outside that circle. I didn't see a way out until instinct took over. I yelled, "Fire!" and threw a serving tray through the nearest window. The glass shattered. Alarms triggered. The chant broke. Guests reacted unpredictably. Some rushed exits, others moved toward us. The confusion was enough. We ran through the broken window, across the grounds, and to the van. I drove while calling 911, reporting an attempted homicide in progress. Law enforcement response escalated quickly. Local deputies arrived first, followed by state police. By morning, federal agents were involved. The investigation uncovered an evidence cache across the property, buried remains in an old family cemetery, financial ledgers detailing payouts, recordings stored in a locked archive room documenting past ceremonies. Victims were identified as transients, runaways, people without immediate ties. Marcus Kincaid was arrested along with 17 others. The young man, Aaron Mills, survived. During the trial, defense attorneys claimed symbolism. Prosecutors presented DNA, timestamps, and decades of records. The institutional silence became part of the case. Local complaints ignored, missing persons reports dismissed. Sentences were handed down. Ravenswood Estate was seized. I left catering shortly after. The property remains under federal control, but not all records were released. Some names in the ledgers were redacted. Some guests were never charged. Every Halloween, I think about how easily it could have continued, and how many traditions exist because no one ever interrupts them. The Haunted Hayride Operator. My name is Ethan Briggs. In the fall of 2015, I was 29 years old, living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and working seasonal jobs that required more patience than ambition. I wasn't running from anything. I wasn't chasing anything either. I had learned that routine was safer than momentum. Most mornings I woke before sunrise, drove to whichever temporary job was paying that week, kept my head down, and went home. The nights were quiet. I read, slept early, and avoided places where people expected conversation. That was my normal. That was my control. The haunted hayride job at Thornfield Farm fit cleanly into that pattern. It was seasonal, mechanical, and isolated. The fear was scripted. The danger was supposed to be imaginary. I'd operated tractors before, orchards, cornfields, even a Christmas tree farm outside York. The haunted hayride wasn't much different mechanically. Same engines, same physics. Just more people on the trailer and more noise in the woods. Thornfield Farm had been running Halloween events for over a decade. Corn mazes, pumpkin patches, a petting zoo during the day. At night in October, it became something else. Chainsaws with the blades removed, actors in makeup, strobe lights wired into trees. My job was to drive the tractor pulling a flatbed trailer outfitted with hay bales and bench seating. The route was fixed. The speed was fixed. I stopped at marked points so actors could jump out, scream, and disappear. I didn't interact with guests beyond safety reminders. I liked that. The Brennans, owners of the farm, handled hiring themselves, no corporate structure, no HR department. I met them in a converted farmhouse office that smelled like old paper and coffee. They asked about my experience, my availability, whether I was comfortable working late in the woods. I said yes to everything. The pay was $18 an hour, which was higher than most seasonal work in the area. I didn't ask why. I signed the paperwork, got a laminated badge, and was told to arrive 2 hours before sunset on my first night. The first hint that something wasn't right came during orientation. There were about 20 of us. Actors, drivers, ticket booth staff. The Brennans went over safety rules, emergency radio codes, and what to do if a guest panicked. Standard stuff. But when someone asked about the far section of the hayride route, the stretch that ran deepest into the woods, the answer was vague. "Stick to the markers," Mr. Brennan said. "Don't wander off." That wasn't unusual on its own. What stood out was how quickly he moved on, and how no one else followed up. After the meeting, I tried making small talk with a man named Carl who worked the farm year-round. I asked if he'd ever driven the hayride. "No," he said too quickly. "Why not?" He shrugged. "That route's not for us." He didn't smile when he said it. Thornfield Farm sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off a county highway and narrowed as it went. The last quarter-mile was unlit. Trees crowded the edges, their branches arching inward like they were trying to close the road behind you. There was no cell service past the gate. Radios were the only reliable communication. During daylight, the property looked like any working farm: fields, barns, equipment sheds. But the hayride route cut into woods that felt older than the farm itself. Dense, unmanaged, the kind of forest where fallen trees were left where they fell. When I walked the route during the afternoon safety check, I noticed how quickly the temperature dropped under the canopy, how sound changed, how footsteps seemed to carry farther and then disappear altogether. At night, once the generators kicked on and the lights were set, the woods still felt wrong. Not threatening, just indifferent. The first weekend went smoothly. Guests screamed on cue. Actors hit their marks. I drove my route, logged my hours, and went home. The second weekend, small things started happening. Props were out of place. A scarecrow that had been wired upright was found lying flat, stakes pulled cleanly from the ground. Actors complained about hearing movement behind them before their cues, footsteps where no one should have been. Radios crackled with open channels, voices cutting in mid-sentence. Dispatch blamed interference. Once, during a stop deep in the woods, everything went quiet. No insects, no wind, no distant generator hum. The guests laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the show. I checked my watch. 23 seconds passed before sound returned all at once, like someone flipping a switch. No report was filed. By the third weekend, I started writing things down. I kept a small notebook in the tractor cab, fuel levels, engine checks, notes for myself. I added dates and times when something felt off. Missing actors, radios dropping out at the same location every night. Guests pointing into the trees and asking if that guy was supposed to be there. It was always the same stretch of the route. Always after full dark. Always farthest from the road. And every time I mentioned it, management dismissed it. Kids messing around. People get spooked easily. It's Halloween. I wanted to believe that. October 24th was a Saturday, cold, clear, busy. I was halfway through my third run of the night when the tractor sputtered and died. No warning, no gradual loss of power. 1 second it was running fine, the next it wasn't. I checked the gauges. Fuel was fine. Battery indicator was normal. The guests started murmuring. Someone laughed and said, "Nice touch." I told them to stay seated and radioed dispatch for a backup tractor. While I waited, I noticed something else. The scare actors assigned to that section, 2 guys dressed as zombie farmers, weren't at their marks. Their props were there, pitchfork, scarecrow dummy, but no actors. I stepped off the tractor with my flashlight and walked toward the tree line, calling their names. That's when I saw the drag marks. They were clear impressions in the dirt, leading off the path and into the woods. Not footprints. Something heavier, something pulled. I should have waited. I didn't. About 100 yards in, I found them. Both actors were tied upright to trees with old rope. Real rope, not props. Their costumes were torn, faces bruised. They were alive, but unconscious. I cut the ropes with my pocket knife and radioed dispatch again, this time using the medical emergency code. That's when I heard footsteps. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught on a figure standing about 30 feet away. It wasn't one of our actors. The clothing was layered and tattered, like something out of a century-old photograph. The face was covered by a burlap sack with crude eye holes cut into it. It didn't move. It didn't speak. Then I heard more footsteps. Behind me, to my left, to my right. I turned in a slow circle, my light catching more figures at the edge of the beam. 5, maybe more. All dressed the same way. All silent. I shouted that this was private property, that they needed to leave. None of them reacted. I didn't think. I acted. I hauled the actors to their feet and ran. They stumbled, barely conscious, but adrenaline carried them. The figures followed. They didn't rush. They didn't break into a sprint. They kept pace, confident, like they knew exactly where we were going. We broke out of the woods onto the dirt road just as a backup tractor arrived. 2 staff members jumped down and helped me load the injured actors. The figures stopped at the tree line. They stood there, watching, until we pulled away. Then they stepped back into the woods and disappeared. Pennsylvania State Police and the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office arrived within the hour. Statements were taken. Photos were snapped. The woods were searched. A sheriff's deputy suggested it might have been unsanctioned performers. Another said it could have been a prank gone wrong. When I mentioned the rope, the bruises, the way they moved, the comments were written down but not discussed. The actors were taken to the hospital. Both had concussions. Neither could remember what happened. The hayride shut down for the night. The next day, police found the cabin. It was about a quarter mile from the hayride route, deep in the woods, partially collapsed. Not marked on any of the farm's maps. Inside were signs of habitation, old bedding, candles, food wrappers, and photographs. Dozens of them. Surveillance shots of the farm, guests, boarding trailers, staff during setup, close-ups of license plates at the gate. Some photos were years old. Pinned to one wall was a hand-drawn map of Thornfield Farm. Routes marked, revised, crossed out and redrawn. Someone had been watching, documenting, planning. The evidence was cataloged and assigned a case number. Within 48 hours, that file was reclassified. When I asked for updates, I was told the investigation was ongoing. When I asked about the cabin, I was told it was no longer relevant. The Brennans were advised to suspend nighttime operations. No public statement was made about the photographs. A week later, the cabin was demolished. No suspects were named, no arrests made. I returned to the farm during daylight to collect my gear. As I loaded my truck, I noticed fresh footprints near the woods, barely visible, but recent. Pinned to my driver's side door was a photograph. It showed me on the tractor, taken from behind, time-stamped the night before. I never reported that photo. Months later, I was contacted by a federal investigator. He asked about my notebook, about my observations, about the photograph. I told him I didn't have it anymore. That wasn't entirely true. Thornfield Farm shut down its Haunted Hayride permanently. The property was sold in 2017 to an out-of-state holding company. The case remains open but inactive. The group identified in internal documents as the Old Harvest was never located. Every October, I check hayride listings across Pennsylvania. I look at aerial maps. I count distances to the nearest road. I still have that photograph. And sometimes, late at night, I think about how patient those figures were, how certain. And I wonder how many other places are already quiet. The costume shop manager. My name is Alicia Tran. In October of 2019, I was 33 years old and managing a retail costume shop called Masquerade Unlimited in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was not a glamorous job, but it was steady, and in this city, steady matters. The French Quarter operates on rhythms older than the people who work there. Every morning, I unlocked the iron gate, flipped on the same lights, and swept the same dust tracked in from Bourbon Street. I checked the register, reviewed the inventory clipboard, and waited for the first customers to wander in. October was our peak season. Halloween in New Orleans is not a single night but a month-long escalation. By mid-October, the sidewalks were already crowded with half-finished costumes, face paint, and open containers. Police presence increased, but so did the noise complaints and ambulance sirens. Inside the shop, it was controlled chaos. Masks hung from pegboards. Wigs were stacked in labeled bins. High-end custom pieces were locked behind glass. I spent my days resolving minor conflicts, approving refunds, and reminding people not to eat or drink near the merchandise. I lived 6 blocks away in a narrow shotgun house I rented from an older couple who spent half the year in Baton Rouge. My routine rarely changed. I walked to work, stopped at the same corner store for coffee, and listened to local radio on a small speaker behind the counter. I had managed Masquerade Unlimited for 3 years. In that time, I had learned to separate performance from reality. Costumes were tools. Masks were products. Whatever stories people projected onto them were not my concern. The trigger event came on October 29th, 2 days before Halloween. It was late, 8:45 p.m., and we closed at 9. I was already counting the register when the door opened and a man stepped inside. He did not fit the usual pattern of last-minute shoppers. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a long dark coat buttoned to the neck despite the heat. His hair was gray and thin, his expression focused to the point of severity. He didn't browse. He approached the counter and asked if we sold authentic masks. I asked what he meant by authentic. Most people use that word loosely. Handmade, imported, historically styled. He leaned in closer than necessary and said he was looking for masks that had been used, masks with history. We did have a section like that, though it was not heavily advertised. Along the back wall, there was a locked glass case containing vintage and antique masks we had acquired from estate sales, closed theaters, and private collectors. They were expensive, fragile, and rarely sold. I unlocked the case and gestured for him to follow. He examined each mask slowly, methodically. He touched the edges, traced cracks in the paint, peered into the eye sockets. At one point, I noticed his lips moving, as if he were whispering, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. There was something rehearsed about the way he handled them, like he already knew what he was looking for. He stopped in front of a porcelain plague doctor mask. It had a long, curved beak, hollow eyes, and hand-painted detailing that had yellowed with age. It was one of our most expensive pieces, $800. We kept documentation on its provenance, but most customers never asked. He said simply, "This one." He paid in cash, declined a receipt, and did not give his name. When he left, the door closed softly behind him, and the shop felt emptier than it had a moment before. I locked the case and finished closing procedures. I did not think about the man again that night. Halloween itself was relentless. We stayed open until midnight, and from the moment we unlocked the door, the store was full. People shouted over each other. Costumes were tried on and discarded in piles. By 10 o'clock, I was exhausted and running on muscle memory. That was when the woman came in. She pushed through the crowd with purpose, her face pale and drawn. She went straight to the counter and asked if we had sold a plague doctor mask recently. When I said yes, she grabbed my arm hard enough to make me flinch. She told me the mask was dangerous. She said it had belonged to a 19th century physician named Baptiste Roche, a man who had worked during a yellow fever epidemic and used his position to conduct experiments on patients. She said he had killed dozens before he was caught and executed, and that his belongings, including the mask, were supposed to have been destroyed. I told her she was causing a disturbance and needed to leave. Halloween attracts all kinds of people, and I had heard plenty of elaborate stories before. She released my arm but looked at me with something like desperation. "Whoever wears it becomes him," she said. "People die." She left without another word. I made a note in the incident log, more out of habit than concern, and returned to managing the crowd. At 11:30 p.m., my phone rang behind the counter. It was the New Orleans Police Department. An officer asked if we had sold a plague doctor mask the previous evening. There had been a disturbance at a private party in the Garden District. A witness had mentioned a mask that matched our inventory. I provided the information I had: date, approximate time, payment method. The officer thanked me and ended the call. I closed the store an hour later than planned and walked home through streets still full of costumed strangers. The next morning, the news broke. 4 people were dead at a Halloween party in the Garden District. The suspect had been apprehended at the scene wearing a plague doctor mask and carrying a surgical instrument. The reports emphasized the precision of the attack. The victims had been injured in ways consistent with historical surgical techniques. There was no mention of a motive. By noon, reporters were calling the shop. By mid-afternoon, detectives were there in person. They photographed the display case, reviewed sales logs, and requested security footage. I gave a formal statement describing the man who had purchased the mask. I did not mention the woman's warning. The suspect was identified as the customer from October 29th. During interrogation, he claimed he had no memory of the killings. He said he put on the mask at the party, felt an intense cold sensation, and then nothing. Toxicology reports came back clean. He had no prior history of violence. No clear motive emerged. As the investigation continued, I was contacted by a public defender's investigator. She asked about the mask's history. I retrieved our acquisition file, a handwritten ledger entry, a photocopied estate receipt, and correspondence from a private collector. The name Baptiste Roche appeared multiple times. Dates matched outbreaks recorded in city archives. I began to review older documents more carefully. I noticed patterns. Ownership transfers clustered around periods of unexplained violence. The mask would surface, change hands, and then disappear again. In at least 3 documented cases, previous owners had committed violent acts while wearing it. Each case ended with a conviction, but questions remained. When I attempted to access parish records to confirm Roche's execution, I encountered resistance. Requests were delayed or redirected. An archivist told me, off the record, that certain materials were restricted. A city health official denied any knowledge of Roche despite his name appearing in 19th-century death registries. As media attention grew, so did the pushback. A police liaison advised me not to speculate. An evidence request I filed to view the mask after the trial was denied without explanation. Emails went unanswered. One afternoon, a uniformed officer came into the shop and suggested it would be better for everyone if I stopped talking to reporters. Around that time, I started noticing smaller things. Late at night, when I stayed after closing to finish paperwork, the shop felt different. The security monitor would flicker without cause. Once, the back door alarm tripped even though the door hadn't been opened. Another night, all the street noise outside seemed to stop at once, leaving the store sealed in a heavy, unnatural quiet that lasted several minutes. I began locking the office door when I worked late. I checked the security cameras repeatedly, even when nothing appeared to be wrong. The critical evidence came from an unexpected source. A retired pathology professor from Tulane contacted me after seeing an interview. He said he had access to private notes documenting experimental medical practices during the 1853 epidemic. He shared scanned pages that referenced Roche by name. The notes described unauthorized procedures and mentioned a protective mask worn during treatments. There were references to assistants experiencing dissociative states after handling Roche's equipment. I forwarded the files to the defense and later to a federal civil rights office when local channels stopped responding. Weeks later, federal agents interviewed me formally. They asked about evidence handling at NOPD, about the mask's storage, about who had access to the evidence locker. The escalation became personal in subtle ways. One evening, as I walked home, I noticed an unmarked car following me. It maintained distance but matched my turns. When I stopped, it stopped. When I turned onto my block, it drove away. The next day, I received a voicemail with no message, just breathing. The trial concluded in early 2020. The suspect was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The mask was logged for destruction. 2 months later, I learned it had disappeared from the evidence locker. An internal review found no procedural violations. No charges were filed. A joint task force conducted an audit of evidence handling. A supervisor retired early. The matter was closed. I resigned from Masquerade Unlimited the day after the trial ended. I could no longer handle inventory. Masks no longer felt like objects. They felt like vessels. The last update I received came through a federal contact, a sealed addendum noting an unrecovered artifact and advising continued monitoring. No location was listed. New Orleans is a city accustomed to its past bleeding into the present. Most of the time, it is packaged and sold as entertainment. But some things persist. They move quietly. They wait. The mask was never found, and somewhere it may already be back in circulation. The Trick-or-Treat Route Planner. My name is Nathan Cross, and in October of 2014 I was 27 years old, living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, working as a community organizer for a local nonprofit that partnered closely with the city. My work was administrative, slow, and mostly invisible, coordinating volunteers, answering emails, drafting neighborhood notices, and maintaining databases that few people ever thought about unless something went wrong. One of my recurring responsibilities was managing the annual Safe Trick-or-Treat initiative, a program designed to help families navigate Halloween night by identifying participating homes, well-lit streets, and routes that local police agreed to patrol more frequently. I had overseen the project for 3 years without incident. It followed the same structure every time. Homeowners registered their addresses online, confirmed participation, agreed to keep porch lights on, and acknowledged that they would not invite children inside. My team verified the submissions, drove through the neighborhoods to confirm basic safety conditions, then produced printed maps distributed at schools, libraries, and community centers. It was not controversial work. It was not investigative. It was designed to reduce risk, not uncover it. The trigger for everything that followed was an email that arrived on October 25th, 1 week before Halloween. The sender address was unfamiliar, a string of letters and numbers that did not correspond to any domain I recognized. The subject line read, "Urgent, remove 428 Birchwood Lane." The message itself was short, almost clipped. It said only, "Do not include 428 Birchwood Lane on your map. It is not safe. People will get hurt." There was no signature, no explanation, no request for anonymity, just the statement. At first, I assumed it was a prank or an attempt to harass a neighbor. We received false tips every year, usually about candy tampering or exaggerated rumors, but protocol required me to verify. I checked the database. 428 Birchwood Lane was listed, registered on time, and marked as verified. I remembered the address because I had personally driven past it during their route checks. It was a single-family home on a quiet, tree-lined street, well-maintained, with no visible hazards. I replied to the email requesting clarification. I never received a response. 2 days later, on October 27th, I drove to Birchwood Lane in the early evening to resolve the issue in person. The neighborhood was isolated in the way many residential pockets in Ann Arbor are: curving streets, no through traffic, the sound of the city falling away as you turn in. The house at 448 looked exactly as I remembered. The lawn was trimmed. A paper skeleton hung in the front window. Fake cobwebs stretched across the porch railing. The porch light was on, even though it was still light outside. I knocked. A woman answered the door. She appeared to be in her 40s or early 50s, calm, well-spoken, and friendly. She introduced herself as Evelyn Marsh. I explained who I was, why I was there, and asked whether she intended to participate in trick-or-treat that year. She said yes. She had signed up online and was looking forward to it. When I asked if she had sent an email asking to be removed from the map, she looked genuinely confused and said no. Her demeanor did not change. There was no defensiveness or hesitation. I apologized for the interruption, thanked her for participating, and left. I documented the visit as a false alarm and left the address on the map. Halloween night arrived cold and clear. I was coordinating with police patrols from a temporary operations desk set up at a community center, tracking coverage and responding to minor issues. Around 7:30 p.m., I received a call directly from an Ann Arbor police officer assigned to the Birchwood neighborhood. His tone was controlled but urgent. He said there had been an incident at 428 Birchwood Lane and that I needed to come to the scene immediately. When I arrived, the street was blocked off by squad cars. An ambulance was parked near the curb. Parents and children stood clustered at the far end of the block, quiet and visibly shaken. I was escorted past the barrier by a detective who identified herself as Sarah Kowalski. Inside the perimeter, the house looked unchanged from my visit 2 days earlier, but the atmosphere was different. Heavy, tense, controlled. Detective Kowalski explained what had happened. A group of 5 children, ages 7 to 10, had gone to 428 Birchwood Lane as part of a larger group moving through the neighborhood. According to parents waiting on the sidewalk, Evelyn Marsh had opened the door and invited the children inside, telling them she had special treats in the kitchen. This violated every guideline of the program, but it happened quickly. Minutes passed. The children did not come back out. One parent approached the door, knocked, and received no response. He looked through a front window and saw the children sitting in a circle on the living room floor, motionless, staring at something in the center. Evelyn Marsh stood behind them, also motionless, facing inward. He pounded on the door and shouted. No one reacted. He called 911. Police forced entry. Inside, they found the children alive but unresponsive. Eyes open, shallow breathing, no visible injuries. Evelyn Marsh was the same, standing upright, unmoving, her eyes open. Paramedics transported all 6 to the hospital. Toxicology screens were negative. There were no signs of carbon monoxide, drugs, or environmental hazards. Neurological exams showed no immediate cause. For hours, none of them responded to stimuli. While they were being treated, police executed a search of the house. What they found in the basement was later described to me in pieces, then confirmed through reports I was allowed to review. The basement walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with paper. Hundreds of sheets taped and pinned in place. Every page contained the same handwritten sentence, repeated over and over. They must stay, they must not leave, they must stay. There were photographs as well, boxes of them, decades worth. Children photographed in the same pose. Sitting in a circle, eyes forward, expressions blank. Some photos were black and white, others were color. Clothing styles changed across decades, but the composition never did. There were no names, no dates written on the photos, no identifying marks. Records checks revealed that Evelyn Marsh had lived at 428 Birchwood Lane since 1963. She had never moved. She had never married. She had no children. She worked as a school teacher until retiring in 1995. She had no criminal record. What emerged next came from cross-referencing missing persons reports. Over the previous 50 years, at least 12 children had gone missing in Ann Arbor on or around Halloween night. None had ever been found. All 12 had last been seen in or near the Birchwood neighborhood. This information had never been compiled in one place before. It existed across decades of case files, unconnected until this moment. Institutional resistance appeared quickly. The police department issued careful statements emphasizing the lack of direct evidence. The photographs were described as unidentified. The basement writings were labeled personal writings with no clear criminal linkage. The email warning me about the address could not be traced. The sending server no longer existed. When I asked whether earlier complaints or reports about Evelyn Marsh had ever been filed, I was told no records existed. Requests for further information were delayed or redirected. I was advised, unofficially, to stop asking questions. Evelyn Marsh never regained consciousness. She died in the hospital 3 days later from an undiagnosed brain aneurysm. The 5 children eventually woke up. None remembered what happened inside the house. Parents reported changes afterward: nightmares, withdrawal, an aversion to sitting in groups, an irrational fear of circles. No charges were ever filed. The FBI reviewed the case due to the historical missing children angle, but concluded there was insufficient evidence to proceed. The house was cleaned. The basement was stripped. The photographs were cataloged and stored. No identities were ever confirmed. I left community organizing within a year. I moved out of state. I took a job in IT, something quieter. Something that didn't involve maps or addresses, or the assumption that visibility equals safety. Every Halloween since, I think about that email. I think about who sent it, how they knew, and why they reached out anonymously instead of going to the police. I think about the circle in that living room, the silence, the way the system responded only after something went wrong. And I think about how many other addresses exist on maps like the one I helped make. Marked safe, verified, trusted, hiding things no one has put together yet, because no one wants to see them all at once. The Paranormal Investigator. My name is Marcus Brennan. In October of 2013, I was 35 years old and living in Portland, Oregon. At that time, I made my living as an independent paranormal investigator, though that label was misleading. I came from a background in electrical engineering. My early work involved inspecting old buildings, analyzing wiring faults, and documenting environmental factors that produced false reports of haunting. Most cases collapsed under scrutiny: faulty breakers, infrasound, mold exposure, suggestion. My routine was stable. I worked alone, traveled light, and documented everything. I didn't provoke, I didn't speculate. I collected data, archived it, and wrote reports that usually disappointed my clients. That reputation, skeptical, methodical, was why Helen Varga contacted me in October 2013. Her email was brief and restrained. She lived in Estacada, a small town southeast of Portland, surrounded by forest and timberland. She said other investigators had refused to return. She said the activity intensified every year in late October. She asked if I would come alone. That was the trigger. Refusal patterns matter. When multiple teams independently walk away from the same site, it suggests either coordinated exaggeration or something they don't want their names attached to. I accepted the case without negotiating conditions. I arrived on October 26th. Helen's house sat at the end of a gravel road with no through traffic. The nearest neighboring structure was nearly half a mile away. The surrounding forest absorbed sound. Even during the day, the property felt enclosed. The house itself was a two-story craftsman built in the early 1920s. Original wiring. Updated breaker panel, no obvious structural damage. Helen met me at the door. She appeared physically exhausted, but coherent. No slurred speech, no signs of intoxication. She answered questions directly and didn't embellish. She told me her husband had died 5 years earlier. The disturbances began shortly afterward. At first, they were minor: lights, doors, temperature changes. Over time, they escalated. Every Halloween, something appeared in the upstairs hallway. When I asked her to describe it, she hesitated. Then she said it looked like her husband, but wrong, distorted, incomplete. That night, I established baseline readings. EMF levels were normal. Audio recorders picked up only ambient noise. Motion sensors remained inactive. I noted mild anxiety responses in Helen, but nothing that indicated acute psychological distress. On the second night, October 27th, I was reviewing data in the living room when the upstairs hallway sensor triggered. The signal was clean, no power fluctuation, no system fault. I went upstairs. The hallway was unlit. At the far end, something occupied the doorway of Helen's bedroom. Its outline suggested a human form, but proportions were inconsistent. The face appeared blurred, as if depth information was missing. I raised my camera. The figure moved toward me without visible locomotion. I fell backward. The temperature dropped sharply. I felt pressure in my chest, consistent with a stress response, but the cold was external and sustained. It spoke. The voice layered. It referenced Helen by implication, said she had invited it, said she would not release it. Then it was gone. I left the hallway immediately. Helen was awake downstairs. She said she knew what I had seen. That was when she disclosed the seance. In 2009, on Halloween night, Helen had attempted to contact her husband using instructions found online. No facilitator, no closing procedure. She believed she succeeded. Over time, the presence became controlling. It mimicked familiarity, then withdrew it. She had contacted a local priest 2 years earlier. According to her, he visited once, performed a brief blessing, and advised her to seek psychiatric help. There was no follow-up. When I later requested parish records, I was told no documentation existed of the visit. On October 28th, I contacted a former priest I trusted, someone who had left formal ministry but continued private intervention work. He arrived that afternoon. After reviewing Helen's account and my recordings, he concluded that whatever was present had attached itself through grief and ritual. It was not bound to the house alone. The recommendation was relocation, permanent, no return. That night, Helen packed essentials and left for Seattle. Before leaving, we installed motion-activated cameras in the upstairs hallway and sealed the bedroom. The house was left unoccupied. For 3 days, nothing happened, no triggers, no audio anomalies. On October 31st, at exactly midnight, the hallway camera activated. The figure appeared motionless, then turned toward the lens. The video distorted. The feed terminated. When I returned the next day, the camera housing was damaged from the inside. Components showed heat exposure inconsistent with electrical failure. I attempted to file a report. The local sheriff's department documented property damage but declined further investigation. They suggested vandalism, despite no signs of forced entry. When I contacted the county records office about prior complaints associated with the address, I was told those records were sealed due to non-criminal determinations. In early 2014, Helen sold the property to a development firm. The house was demolished. I attempted to retrieve the demolition permit and inspection reports. Several documents were missing. Others were unsigned. The developer declined comment. I archived the footage. Copies were requested later by an academic research group, but the original files degraded without clear cause. Helen never returned to the house. She has not reported further incidents, though she does not speak about that period. I still work investigations, but my methods changed after Estacada. I no longer assume misinterpretation. I no longer accept cases involving unresolved ritual activity. And every October, I review the archived files that remain incomplete. The land where that house stood is occupied now, new construction, new owners. No reports officially, but there are records that stop abruptly. And there are questions no agency wanted to answer. And there is one address I still avoid driving past, even in daylight. The Emergency Dispatcher. My name is Rachel Kowalski. In October of 2012, I was 30 years old and working as an emergency dispatcher for the Westchester County 911 system in New York. I'd been on the job for 6 years. By that point, my life ran on routine. Night shifts, coffee that went cold before I remembered to drink it, scripted questions delivered without hesitation. The work demanded emotional distance. You learn to flatten your voice, to become a conduit instead of a participant. Most nights blurred together. The calls followed patterns. Medical alarms triggered accidentally. Domestic arguments that resolved before officers arrived. Car accidents where everyone walked away. Even on busy nights, the chaos stayed contained inside the headset. Halloween was always louder, but not more dangerous. Costumes, pranks, motion sensors tripped by kids cutting through yards. You learned to filter the noise. On October 31st, 2012, I clocked in at 6 p.m. The shift briefing was brief. No special advisories. By 9 p.m., I had already cleared more than a dozen calls, nothing memorable. At 9:47 p.m., A call came in from a local cell phone number. The connection was weak. The caller was a woman. She was whispering, as if she were afraid sound itself might carry. She said there was someone in her house. I followed protocol, asked for the address. She gave a location in Mount Kisco, a quiet suburban area north of White Plains. Single-family homes, tree-lined streets. I dispatched patrol units immediately and stayed on the line. She told me she was upstairs, hiding in a bedroom closet. She believed there was more than one person downstairs. She said they had come to the door wearing costumes. She thought they were trick-or-treaters. As she spoke, I documented every word, timestamps, dispatch notes. The officers were less than 4 minutes away. Then I heard movement through the phone. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, not running. She told me they were coming upstairs. At that point, the room around me disappeared. Training took over. I told her to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I watched the unit tracker tick down seconds. Another voice came through the line. Male, distorted, like it was filtered or electronically altered. He said, clearly, "We know you're here." The woman screamed. There was a brief struggle. The phone dropped. The line stayed open. 30 seconds later, officers arrived on scene. They found the front door open, lights on. Signs of disturbance in the upstairs bedroom. The closet door was open. The phone was on the floor, still connected to my console. There was no victim. The homeowner was identified as Claire Donovan, 34 years old, lived alone. Neighbors confirmed she had been home earlier that evening, handing out candy. No one reported seeing her leave. No one reported seeing anyone unusual enter the house. That should have been the end of my involvement. Dispatchers aren't investigators. We log, we route, we move on. But the next morning, I was called into my supervisor's office. They told me not to discuss the call. Not with colleagues, not with friends. They said the recording would be handled internally. I asked what that meant. I was told the audio quality was poor. The portions of the call were inconclusive. When I accessed the system later that week, the call log had been edited. The timestamps were intact, but the transcript summary had been shortened. The reference to the second voice was gone. I requested a copy of the audio through proper channels. The request was denied. Over the next several days, detectives came and went from the center. They asked general questions. None of them asked about the altered log. When I raised the issue with the lieutenant I recognized, he told me it was an active investigation and advised me to focus on my duties. Claire Donovan remained missing. Forensics processed the house. They found evidence of forced entry through the back door, partial fingerprints that didn't match anyone in the system. Traces of a chemical compound on the bedroom carpet that couldn't be immediately identified. The information was never released publicly. 2 weeks later, a hiker found a body near Croton Reservoir, about 8 miles from Claire's home. It was her. The autopsy placed her death close to the night of the call. Cause of death was blunt force trauma. What stood out was her clothing. She was dressed in a witch's costume, hat, dress, plastic broom. According to her family, she didn't own that costume. When the news broke, something shifted inside the department. Conversations stopped when supervisors entered the room. The call was no longer mentioned. The edited log remained unchanged. Then an agent from the FBI requested access to our archived calls. That's when I learned Claire Donovan wasn't the first. The FBI identified 3 prior cases, stretching back to 2009. Different counties, same pattern. Women living alone, Halloween night, visit from people in costumes, disappearance within hours. Bodies recovered days or weeks later, each dressed in a costume not owned by the victim. The cases had been handled by different jurisdictions. None had been publicly linked. The dispatcher audio from those cases showed similarities. Whispered calls, reports of intruders wearing masks. In 2 instances, a second voice on the line that had been classified as background noise. The Bureau requested the original audio from my call. That's when my supervisor told me the file was corrupted. I knew that wasn't true. I had heard it. I had logged it. The system stored redundant backups. Someone had made a decision. When federal subpoenas were issued, the recording surfaced. Portions were degraded. Others were missing entirely. The phrase, "We know you're here," was no longer audible. Officially, it could not be verified. The FBI expanded the investigation. Task forces were formed. Public advisories were quietly circulated to local departments about Halloween safety and impersonation risks. No arrests were made. The killing stopped after 2012. I left dispatching the following year. Officially, it was burnout. Unofficially, I couldn't sit in that chair anymore. Every night shift felt like waiting for another call that wouldn't be preserved correctly. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the call in my head. Not the scream, not the struggle. The moment before, when the house went quiet, when even the wind on the line seemed to stop. Someone was listening then. Someone who knew exactly where she was. No one has ever explained why parts of that call were altered. No one has been held accountable for the missing audio. The task force still lists the cases as open. Halloween still comes every year. Masks still make strangers invisible. And somewhere, someone learned that the right night, the right costume, and institutional silence are enough to make a person disappear. The College Dormitory Resident Advisor. In October of 2011, I was 22 years old, a senior at Ohio State University, and a resident advisor in Morrison Hall. My days were structured and repetitive by design. I attended classes in the morning, held office hours in the afternoon, and spent evenings enforcing quiet hours, documenting policy violations and mediating roommate disputes. Morrison Hall housed roughly 400 freshmen. Most of my job involved noise complaints, alcohol write-ups, and the occasional broken exit sign. I believed in rules and routine. They made a large building manageable. Halloween week was always the most demanding period of the semester. Students pushed boundaries, and pranks escalated. I expected exhaustion, not uncertainty. Morrison Hall was an older dormitory, built in 1967. And like many older campus buildings, it had accumulated stories. The most persistent involved a room 419, a fourth-floor room tied to an alleged suicide in the 1970s. I considered it folklore. Every dorm had a room like that. On the evening of October 29th, I received a call from a freshman named Emily Ross, assigned to room 419. She reported repeated knocking on her door. Each time she answered, the hallway was empty. Her voice on the phone was strained, but not hysterical. I assumed it was a prank timed for Halloween weekend. I went to the 4th floor to investigate. Emily opened the door immediately. She looked tired and shaken. Before I could ask questions, she pointed to the inside of her door. Scratched into the wood, below eye level, were 3 words: "Let me in." The marks were deep, uneven, and fresh. This wasn't marker or pen. It looked like it had been done with something sharp, or with significant force. I documented the damage and took photos using my phone, then reassured Emily we would treat it as vandalism. I initiated a temporary room reassignment for her that night and filed a report with campus security. By 11 p.m., additional calls came in from the same floor. Different students, same complaint. Knocking, scratching sounds, soft voices at their doors. No one visible when checked. Another RA and I conducted a full-floor sweep. We walked the hallways, knocked on doors, and checked common areas. No one admitted to pranking. When we reached room 419, it was empty and locked. Only Emily and I had access. The scratches on the inside of the door had multiplied. They weren't random. They radiated outward, clustered around the handle and lock, as if someone had been trying to get out. Or in. The hallway was silent in a way that felt unnatural for a college dorm on a Saturday night. Even the usual HVAC hum seemed absent. This was the first silent dread moment, the sense of being observed without evidence, of sound withdrawing rather than amplifying. Campus security arrived shortly after midnight. The officer photographed the door, searched the room, and found nothing else disturbed. He took the report seriously but offered no explanation. Before leaving, he said something I wrote down later. "This building has a history. You might want to look into it." The next morning, I did. I went to the university archives, accessed through the student library system, and requested incident records related to Morrison Hall. After several hours and a supervisor's approval, I found a file dated March 1973. The name listed was Thomas Crane, age 18, freshman, occupant of room 419. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by overdose. The supplemental notes told a different story. Thomas had been found deceased in his locked room. The interior of the door showed extensive scratching. His hands and forearms were marked with deep abrasions. Witness statements from students on the fourth floor described knocking sounds in the nights prior, whispered voices, and Thomas expressing fear that someone was trying to get into his room. A university physician had noted signs of distress inconsistent with accidental overdose. The conclusion labeled his behavior as drug-induced paranoia. The file included maintenance reports referencing interior structural damage to room 419 that was repaired quietly over spring break. No memorial, no dorm-wide notice. I brought copies of these records to my residence director. She skimmed them and dismissed my concerns. She said the building was old, that students were suggestible around Halloween, and that spreading panic would be irresponsible. She instructed me to stop looking into it and to redirect future complaints to facilities as noise issues. That response marked the institutional resistance phase. Reports continued, but documentation stopped. Requests for additional security patrols were denied. Maintenance logs were sealed for routine review. Over the next 2 nights, incidents increased. All reports originated from the 4th floor. All involved knocking, scratching, and voices. Some students claimed the sounds followed them inside their rooms, stopping only when they left the floor entirely. I began to feel watched during my rounds. Doors seemed to close behind me. The hallway outside room 419 felt colder than the rest of the floor. When I stood there, the ambient noise dropped to nothing. On October 31st, I made a decision without notifying my supervisor. I brought my laptop into room 419 and set it up to record audio and video. I wanted evidence, something objective that couldn't be dismissed. I locked the door behind me and waited. At approximately 2:07 a.m., the knocking began. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. I checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. The whisper followed shortly after. 3 words, spoken clearly. "Let me in." The voice wasn't coming from the door. It was inside the room. Scratching began on the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. The sound surrounded me without a visible source. The temperature dropped rapidly. My breath fogged. I grabbed my laptop and unlocked the door. The hallway lights flickered, then stabilized. Sound returned all at once. Distant voices, running water, HVAC noise. I ran until I was outside the building. Campus security responded again. This time, I refused to re-enter. I submitted my recordings and filed a formal incident report. The next morning, Morrison Hall was closed for emergency maintenance. Students were relocated. The official explanation cited a heating system malfunction. A maintenance worker I spoke to privately told me the truth. Room 419 was destroyed. Furniture overturned. Walls deeply gouged. Windows shattered outward. In the center of the floor, scratched into the concrete beneath the carpet, were the same words, "Let me in." Federal and state authorities were never publicly involved. The university handled the matter internally. Morrison Hall reopened in January 2012 after extensive renovations. Room 419 was converted into a locked storage space. Records related to Thomas Crane remain partially sealed. I graduated later that year and left student housing permanently. The unresolved threat remains in the silence around that room, in the records that still aren't accessible, and in the knowledge that institutional order often exists to contain, not confront. I still think about Thomas Crane, and about what happens when a door is locked from the inside and something still wants to enter. The security guard at the Abandoned Asylum. My name is Daniel Foster. In October of 2010, I was 38 years old and working overnight security contracts in and around Baltimore. I'd been doing private security for years by then, mostly unremarkable sites. Warehouses, office parks, construction properties shut down after hours. I preferred night shifts because they were predictable. Fewer people meant fewer variables, and fewer variables meant fewer surprises. At that point in my life, I valued routine more than anything else. I showed up, followed procedure, logged what I saw, and went home when the sun came up. That was the job, and it suited me. That fall, my assignment was Greystone Asylum, an abandoned psychiatric facility on the outskirts of the city. It had been shut down in 1994 after decades of lawsuits alleging patient abuse, falsified records, and unexplained deaths. A development company had purchased the property years later with plans to convert it into luxury condominiums, but the project stalled due to funding problems. Until construction resumed, or the property was sold again, my company had been contracted to provide overnight security. The pay was higher than most posts, largely because the site was massive and isolated, and no one wanted to work there alone. I didn't mind. Isolation had never bothered me. Greystone consisted of 3 main buildings connected by underground tunnels, all surrounded by a rusted fence and overgrown gardens that hadn't been maintained in decades. Once you passed through the gate, the city felt very far away. There was no cell service inside the buildings, and a radio reception dropped intermittently in the tunnels. Sound behaved oddly in the halls, echoing longer than it should, then cutting off abruptly. Still, for the first 4 months, nothing unusual happened. My nights followed the same pattern. Arrive at 10 p.m., sign in, complete a perimeter walk, check doors and access points, then patrol the buildings and tunnels. By midnight, I'd usually be back in the security office, filling out logs or watching old movies on my laptop until the next scheduled round. Late in October, small irregularities started appearing. Broken windows I was certain had been intact the previous night. Graffiti sprayed in hallways I had just inspected. Footprints and layers of dust inside rooms that had been locked. I reported each incident as protocol required. My supervisor told me it was probably kids looking for a scare before Halloween. Oh, he advised me to increase patrol frequency and call local police if I saw anyone on site. His response didn't suggest concern, just mild annoyance at extra paperwork. As Halloween approached, the disturbances became more specific. Doors unlocked that I had personally secured. Lights left on overnight in isolated wings. A chair moved across a room with no explanation. None of it was dramatic, but the consistency bothered me. It always seemed to happen in the same areas of the complex, particularly in the oldest building, the one that had housed the most severe psychiatric cases before closure. During downtime, I started reviewing archived site documents stored in the office, floor plans, maintenance reports, old inspection notes. Certain room numbers appeared repeatedly in records from the years leading up to the asylum's shutdown. Room 317 came up more than once, usually attached to vague language about incidents or containment failures. When I mentioned this to my supervisor, he dismissed it and told me old records were unreliable. He reminded me that my job was to observe present conditions, not investigate history. On October 30th, I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m. as usual. The site was quiet. I completed my first patrol without issue, checked all 3 buildings and the tunnels, and returned to the security office. That's when I saw the file on my desk. It hadn't been there earlier. It was a patient file. Original paper, yellowed with age, stamped with the Greystone Asylum logo. The name on the cover was Victor Halloway. Inside was a psychiatric evaluation dated 1987. It detailed a history of violent behavior, a diagnosis of schizophrenia, repeated incidents of isolation and restraint. Clipped inside was a photograph. Victor was 16 years old, thin, pale, staring directly at the camera with an expression that wasn't angry or frightened, just empty. All patient records were supposed to have been removed years earlier. I had no explanation for how that file ended up on my desk. I called my supervisor immediately. He sounded irritated, told me it was probably an overlooked file left behind during closure or an inspection. He instructed me to lock it up and said he'd deal with it in the morning. When I asked who else had access to the office, he didn't answer directly. He just repeated the instruction and ended the call. I logged the incident and locked the file in a drawer, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. During my next patrol, I carried my flashlight and radio instead of leaving them behind. I started in the main building, moving slowly, checking doors and stairwells. Halfway up the stairwell, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Singing. It was faint, distant, echoing through the halls. The voice sounded young, calm, almost rhythmic. I radioed dispatch and reported a possible intruder. They said a patrol car was en route, but it would take about 20 minutes. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The singing led me to the 3rd floor. The hallway was empty, emergency lights casting long shadows across peeling paint and cracked tiles. The sound stopped in front of room 317. I pushed the door open. The room was bare except for an old metal bed frame bolted to the floor. Above it, scratched deep into the wall as if carved by fingernails, were the words, "Victor is still here." The singing stopped completely. The door behind me slammed shut and locked. The temperature dropped fast enough that I could see my breath. I heard footsteps, not approaching but circling, coming from a corner of the room where nothing stood. I backed against the door, flashlight shaking in my hand. When the beam swept across the corner, it caught a figure for a split second. A teenage boy, pale and thin, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Bare feet. Hollow eyes identical to the photograph in the file. He didn't speak. He smiled. Then he was gone. The door unlocked immediately. I ran. down the stairs, through the corridors, out of the building. I didn't stop until I reached the gate, where a police cruiser was pulling in. I told the officers everything. They searched the building and photographed the writing in room 317. They found no intruder. The next day, I researched Victor Halloway. He died at Greystone in 1989. The official cause was listed as suicide, but internal staff notes referenced unexplained circumstances and conflicting witness statements. When I contacted my supervisor again, he told me not to return to the site. Greystone was quietly removed from my company's active contracts the following month. The development project was halted indefinitely. No public explanation was given. I quit Allied Protection Services the day after Halloween. I've worked other security jobs since, but I refuse assignments at abandoned facilities. Greystone still sits unused, fenced off and silent. Some records disappear, some places never empty, and some names remain even after the walls are repainted. The Uber driver. My name is Carlos Medina. In October of 2009, I was 41 years old and working the night shift as a cab driver in Austin, Texas. This was before rideshare apps dominated the city. At that time, I drove for Yellow Cab Austin, a company that relied on radio dispatch, handwritten logs, and a lot of driver discretion. I worked nights because they paid better and because I preferred the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Austin is a different city at night. During the day, it's tech offices, students, traffic. After midnight, it thins out, streets empty, neighborhoods go dark. You start noticing how far apart things really are. My routine rarely changed. I clocked in around 6 p.m., checked my cab for damage, signed out a radio unit, and drove until sunrise. I knew which bars tipped, which neighborhoods didn't, and which addresses to avoid. After nearly 10 years behind the wheel, I'd learned to read people quickly. Drunks, tourists, locals, troublemakers, it was all part of the job. Halloween was always the exception. On Halloween night, the entire city felt overstimulated. 6th Street became a continuous crowd from sunset to morning. Police blocked intersections. Ambulances staged nearby. Drivers made good money, but only if they stayed alert. Fights broke out. People tried to cram 6 or 7 passengers into a back seat. It was controlled disorder. By 2 a.m. on October 31st, I'd already completed more fares than I usually did in an entire shift. Around 2:30, after dropping off a group of college students near the University of Texas campus, I radioed in as available. Dispatch came back almost immediately with a pickup request in East Austin near the old Blackland neighborhood. That caught my attention. East Austin wasn't party territory in 2009. At that hour, it was mostly residential, quiet. I considered declining the call, but work had been slow earlier in the week, and Halloween fares were too valuable to pass up. The address led me off the main roads and into a neighborhood of single-story houses, chain-link fences, and overgrown yards. Porch lights were mostly off. There were no other cars moving. The contrast from downtown was immediate and unsettling in its own way. I pulled up to the address. The house matched the description. Small, weathered, porch light, dark. I waited. No movement. I honked once, then again. I was about to mark it as a no-show when the front door opened. A man stepped out. At first, I assumed it was just another Halloween costume. He wore a long black coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and a full-face mask. The mask was white and completely smooth, with only 2 black eye holes, no mouth, no nose, no expression. He walked slowly to the cab, opened the back door, and got in without acknowledging me. "Where to?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He sat perfectly still, facing forward. After several seconds, he said very quietly, "Riverside Drive, the old bridge." I knew the area. Riverside Drive followed the Colorado River, and the bridge he was referring to had been closed for years. It wasn't lit properly and wasn't safe for vehicles. "The bridge is closed," I told him. "I can take you near the park." "No," he said, "the bridge." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. I hesitated. Against my better judgment, I started driving. The ride was silent. He didn't move. He didn't look around. I tried making casual conversation, commenting on Halloween, asking about his costume, but he didn't respond. As we got closer to Riverside, the city thinned out again. Streetlights became sparse. There were no other cars on the road. When we reached the turnoff toward the bridge, I slowed down. "I can't go onto the bridge," I said. "I could lose my license." He leaned forward. Through the eye holes of the mask, I could see his eyes. Dark, focused, unblinking. "Stop here," he said. I pulled over about 50 yards from the bridge entrance. He opened the door, stepped out, then turned back toward me. "Do you know what happened here?" he asked. I shook my head. 14 people died, he said. 1963, a bus accident. Children. Before I could respond, he closed the door and walked toward the bridge. I watched him in the rearview mirror as his figure receded into the darkness. I waited a moment. Then it hit me. He hadn't paid. I got out of the cab and called after him. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and walked a short distance toward the bridge. The structure loomed ahead, rusted and partially obscured by trees. He was gone. I returned to my cab, uneasy and irritated. That's when I noticed something on the back seat, a photograph. Old, black and white, frayed edges. It showed a group of children standing in front of a bus, smiling at the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, was a date, October 31st, 1963. The next day, I started researching. City archives confirmed it. In 1963, a school bus returning from a Halloween event lost control on that bridge and plunged into the river. 14 children died. The driver's body was never recovered. I reported the incident to my dispatcher. The response was dismissive. No record of the pickup appeared in the logs. When I contacted the police non-emergency line, they told me no reports had been filed involving the bridge that night. Over the next week, I kept digging. I found old newspaper clippings, incomplete accident reports, and references to lawsuits quietly settled. The bridge had been closed not just for safety reasons, but following pressure from the city to avoid renewed attention. When I requested more detailed records, I was told they were unavailable. A city clerk suggested I let it go. I noticed changes in my routine after that. Late at night, when I drove near Riverside, I felt watched. Once, while parked nearby, all ambient noise seemed to stop at once. No insects, no traffic, nothing. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it stayed with me. A week later, a supervisor called me into the office. He advised me not to talk about the incident with passengers or other drivers. He said the company didn't want liability issues. When I asked about the missing fare record, he had no answer. I kept the photograph. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt like evidence. Maybe because throwing it away felt wrong. I stopped driving Halloween nights after that. Eventually, I left night shifts entirely. The bridge remains closed. Officially, the case is history, but records are incomplete and questions remain unanswered. Some fares don't show up in the logs. Some stories aren't meant to disappear. And some places, no matter how busy the city becomes, never really let go of what happened there. The Neighborhood Watch Coordinator. My name is Patricia Donnelly. In October of 2008, I was 56 years old and living in Beaverton, Oregon, a planned suburb west of Portland where the streets curved gently and most houses looked alike. I had retired from teaching 3 years earlier. My days were predictable. Morning walks, volunteering at the library, monthly homeowners meetings. In retirement, structure mattered. I had been the coordinator of our Neighborhood Watch program for nearly 5 years. It wasn't a prestigious role. I kept a binder with contact lists, scheduled quarterly meetings, and acted as the liaison with the local police precinct. Our area rarely needed it. The most serious incidents we dealt with were unlocked cars and missing packages. People left porch lights on. Children biked between cul-de-sacs without supervision. That sense of routine was the point. Safety through familiarity. The first disruption came in mid-October. A woman 2 streets over reported her cat missing. Then another. Then a small terrier that had never left its yard. All disappeared within a week, all within a 2-block radius. We told ourselves it was coyotes. There had been sightings along the creek. Animal control agreed it was plausible. Then Susan Clark called me on October 24th. Susan lived alone. She was practical, not prone to exaggeration. She told me she had woken around 3 in the morning and looked out her bedroom window. Someone was standing in her backyard near the fence. Not moving, just standing there. She had called the police. By the time officers arrived, the yard was empty. No footprints. No damage to the fence. 2 nights later, another neighbor reported the same thing. Same hour, same stillness. A figure watching the house. I contacted our precinct liaison. He suggested increased awareness and advised residents to keep doors locked. There was no reportable crime. No description beyond a person. I called an emergency neighborhood watch meeting. About 20 residents showed up. We reviewed the incidents. We agreed to organize overnight patrols. Pairs of volunteers walking preset routes in 2-hour shifts. We logged names and times in my binder. I kept copies. On October 30th, I took the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift with a neighbor named Greg Mitchell. Greg was a contractor, steady and calm. We carried flashlights and phones. The streets were silent in the way suburbs get after midnight. No traffic. Porch lights glowing without sound. For the first hour, we saw nothing. Around 3 a.m., as we passed Susan Clark's house, Greg stopped and grabbed my arm. He pointed toward her backyard. A figure stood under the porch light. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing. Completely still. We called out, identifying ourselves and stating that police had been contacted. There was no response. We moved closer, cautiously. That was when I noticed the face, or the absence of one. The figure wore a smooth white mask, featureless, no eye holes, no mouth. It reflected the porch light evenly, like porcelain. Greg reached for his phone. The figure tilted its head slightly, then turned and walked toward the back fence. It climbed over with practiced ease and disappeared. Police arrived within minutes. They searched the yards and alleyways. They found nothing. Still, they took our report. Increased patrols were promised. The incident number was written down. I added it to the binder. The next night was Halloween. Between midnight and 3 a.m., I received 5 calls. 5 different households, same report. A figure in the yard, motionless, wearing a blank white mask. Police responded to each call. Each time the yard was empty when they arrived. At 3:15 a.m., Tom Reeves called me directly. He sounded unsteady. He told me to come to his house immediately. When I arrived, Tom and his wife stood on the lawn with their 2 teenage daughters. All 4 looked pale. Tom's daughter Emily held out her phone. She had been filming from her bedroom window. The video showed their backyard at exactly 3:02 a.m. A figure appeared near the fence, then another and another, 7 in total. All tall, all wearing the same blank masks. They formed a loose circle and stood perfectly still. After 30 seconds, they turned together to face the house. They did not advance. They stood there, watching. Then they separated, climbing fences and vanishing in different directions. The police arrived while the video was still playing. They took statements. They copied the file. They asked Emily not to share it until it could be reviewed. Within 48 hours, the video was circulating anyway. Local news aired still frames. National outlets followed. The FBI contacted the department and assumed a coordinating role, citing the possibility of organized harassment or cult-related activity. They requested our neighborhood watch logs. I turned over my binder, patrol schedules, call times, incident numbers. Agents interviewed residents. They canvassed surrounding neighborhoods. No one reported seeing the group arrive or leave. No vehicles were identified. No masks were recovered. I asked a detective why no public warning had been issued earlier after the first reports. He told me there hadn't been enough information. He advised me not to speculate. In early November, I requested copies of the police reports for our records. Several were delayed. When they arrived, descriptions had been generalized. The word mask appeared inconsistently. The number of figures was sometimes listed as unknown. The FBI never released a summary of their findings. After 2 weeks, the agents stopped coming. The figures never returned. There were no arrests. Over the next year, families moved away. Houses stayed on the market longer. People stopped volunteering for the watch. I stepped down as coordinator in 2009. Officially, it was fatigue. Unofficially, I no longer believed in prevention through visibility. Sometimes, late at night, I replay Emily's video in my mind. The moment before they turn. The absolute stillness. The way the yard seems to hold its breath. No one ever explained who they were or what they wanted. No one explained why the reports were softened or why the investigation ended without conclusion. The neighborhood looks the same now. Fresh paint, new families, different faces. But every Halloween, when porch lights come on and masks appear at doors, I remember how easy it was for 7 people to stand in plain sight and never be identified. Whatever they were testing that night, fear, response time, silence, they learned something. And I don't believe they learned it only once.